For nearly 3 weeks, 81-year-old Walter Hayes woke up every morning to find another section of his broken ranch fence mysteriously repaired. The old farmer lived alone in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, miles from the nearest neighbor. He never hired anyone. No vehicles appeared during the night. No footprints surrounded the fence except a single set of tracks belonging to an old Border Collie that nobody in the valley claimed to own. At first, Walter thought someone was playing a joke. Then, one freezing morning, he discovered a hammer lying beside a newly repaired fence post. Attached to the handle was a faded military dog tag missing for more than 40 years. The name engraved on it belonged to a man Walter had served beside in Vietnam. A man everyone believed died long ago. Winter settled gently across the mountains of eastern Tennessee, covering the valleys with frost while pale morning sunlight stretched across rolling fields surrounding the Hayes family ranch. Walter Hayes stood beside a broken section of fence, holding a rusted pair of pliers and trying not to think about how much work still remained. At 81 years old, every repair took longer than it once had. Every fence post felt heavier. Every cold morning settled deeper into his bones. Yet the ranch represented the last piece of the life he spent decades building. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 6 years earlier. His son lived in Nashville and rarely visited. Most days, Walter's only company came from a handful of horses, several cattle, and the quiet mountains stretching toward the horizon. The previous week's storm had damaged nearly 200 feet of fencing along the northern pasture. Walter spent 3 exhausting days repairing sections before finally giving up for the evening. "Tomorrow," he muttered. "It'll still be there tomorrow." The next morning, he walked outside expecting another day of labor. Instead, he stopped in confusion. 20 feet of fence had already been repaired. Walter stared at the new boards. Fresh nails secured every section. Broken posts had been replaced. The workmanship looked surprisingly professional. For several moments, he simply stood there trying to understand what he was seeing. Eventually, he checked the driveway. No tire tracks. He searched the field. No footprints. Nothing explained how the repairs happened. Assuming a neighbor had quietly helped him, Walter drove into town later that day and thanked everyone he could think of. Each denied any involvement. By the following morning, another section of fence had been repaired. Then another the next day, and another after that. Every sunrise revealed new work completed during the night. Whoever was responsible remained invisible. Walter became obsessed with solving the mystery. One evening, he deliberately sat awake beside the window overlooking the pasture. Midnight passed. Then 1 o'clock. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him. When he awoke at dawn, another section of fence stood repaired. "Impossible," he whispered. The following night, he tried again. This time, he lasted until nearly 3 in the morning. Nothing happened. Yet once again, new repairs appeared by sunrise. It made no sense. Several days later, Walter finally discovered his first clue. Fresh snow covered the ranch after a brief overnight storm. For the first time, tracks remained visible across the property. Walter followed them immediately. They belonged to a dog, a Border Collie. The animal appeared elderly, judging by the uneven stride. The tracks emerged from the forest, traveled directly to the repaired fence, then disappeared back into the mountains. No human footprints accompanied them. Walter frowned. Now that's just ridiculous. Yet the evidence remained. The same pattern repeated over the next week. Fence repairs continued appearing. Dog tracks continued surrounding each location. Human footprints never appeared. The mystery deepened further when Walter asked local residents about the Border Collie. Nobody recognized the description. Nobody claimed ownership. Then came the morning that changed everything. A heavy frost covered the ranch when Walter discovered another repaired section near the northern pasture. This time, something rested beside the fence post. A hammer. Old, worn, familiar. Walter picked it up carefully. A piece of string tied around the handle secured a faded military dog tag. The moment he read the engraving, the world seemed to stop. Thomas Walker, United States Army. Walter felt his knees weaken. He knew that name. 46 years earlier, Thomas Walker had served beside him during the Vietnam War. They survived firefights together, shared rations together, promised to visit one another after returning home. Then Thomas disappeared during an operation near the Cambodian border. Official reports listed him as killed in action. No body was ever recovered. Walter had mourned his friend for decades, Yet now he stood in a frozen pasture holding Thomas Walker's dog tag. The exact tag Thomas wore the last time Walter saw him alive. Walter stared toward the mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges, answers waited. And for the first time since the mysterious repairs began, he realized the story had nothing to do with fences at all. It was about a promise made nearly half a century earlier, and an old Border Collie seemed determined to make sure that promise was finally kept. Walter Hayes barely slept that night. The faded military dog tag sat on the kitchen table beneath a lamp while he stared at it from across the room, unable to convince himself that what he was seeing was real. More than 40 years had passed since Vietnam. More than 40 years since he last saw Thomas Walker alive. Yet the scratches on the metal were unmistakable. Walter remembered them because Thomas himself had made them. During a long week stationed near the Cambodian border, Thomas accidentally dropped the tag while repairing a truck engine. The metal scraped across concrete, leaving a distinctive mark along one edge. Walter had teased him about it for days. No counterfeit could reproduce a memory like that. Somehow, the tag was real. The question was how it ended up beside a fence in rural Tennessee. Even stranger, why had it appeared now? Before sunrise, Walter pulled on his coat and stepped outside. Frost covered the fields. A cold wind drifted through the valley. The old farmer walked directly to the repaired section of fence and searched the surrounding ground. Fresh tracks remained visible in the thin layer of snow. Once again, only the Border Collie's footprints appeared. No human tracks. No vehicle tracks. Nothing else. Walter followed the trail into the forest. The tracks wound through dense woods, climbing steadily toward the mountains. At 81 years old, the hike challenged him immediately, but curiosity pushed him forward. For nearly an hour, he followed the dog's path through frozen terrain. Eventually, the tracks disappeared among rocky ground near an abandoned logging road. Walter stopped to catch his breath. The mountains stretched around him in every direction. Somewhere out there was an old dog carrying the dog tag of a man presumed dead for nearly half a century. He returned home with more questions than answers. Later that afternoon, Walter drove into town and visited the county library. If Thomas Walker had somehow survived the war, there would be records, newspaper articles, military reports, something. The librarian helped him access archived documents dating back decades. Unfortunately, every official source repeated the same story. Sergeant Thomas Walker was declared killed in action in 1975 after disappearing during a combat operation. No remains were recovered. No witnesses survived the attack. The case was eventually closed. Walter sat quietly staring at the screen. "Then whose dog tag am I holding?" he murmured. The librarian had no answer. 3 days passed. Fence repairs continued. Each morning, another section appeared restored. Each morning, the Border Collie's tracks surrounded the work area. Then, just before dawn on the 4th day, Walter finally saw the dog. He happened to glance through the kitchen window while making coffee. Movement near the pasture immediately caught his attention. A black and white Border Collie stood beside the fence. The dog appeared old, very old. Gray fur surrounded its muzzle. One ear drooped slightly. Its movements lacked the energy of a younger animal. Yet despite its age, it worked with remarkable focus. Walter watched in disbelief as the dog tugged a length of rope attached to a loose fence board. The board shifted into position against the post. Then the dog stepped aside. A figure emerged from the darkness. Walter froze. An elderly man stood near the fence holding a hammer. The stranger moved slowly but confidently. Within moments, he secured the board with several nails. Walter's coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered across the floor. By the time he rushed outside, both the man and the dog were already moving toward the tree line. "Wait!" Walter shouted. The figure stopped. For several seconds, neither man moved. Nearly 100 yards separated them, too far to see clearly. Yet Walter felt his heart racing. The stranger's posture seemed familiar. The way he stood, the way he turned his shoulders. Memories buried for decades suddenly resurfaced. "Thomas?" Walter called. The figure remained motionless. The Border Collie looked back toward Walter. Then the old man slowly removed his hat. Even from a distance, Walter recognized the face. Older, thinner, weathered by decades of hardship, but unmistakable. Thomas Walker. Walter felt the world tilt beneath him. 46 years of grief, questions, and uncertainty crashed together in a single moment. "Thomas!" he shouted again. This time the old man nodded. Then, to Walter's complete confusion, he turned and continued walking into the forest. "No!" Walter started after him immediately. Despite aching knees and failing lungs, he pushed himself across the pasture as fast as possible. The Border Collie occasionally looked back, almost as though encouraging him to continue, yet age eventually won. By the time Walter reached the tree line, both had vanished among the mountains. Exhausted, he leaned against a tree and struggled to understand what had happened. Thomas Walker was alive. Alive. After nearly half a century, yet instead of approaching him directly, Thomas chose to remain hidden. Why? The answer arrived unexpectedly later that evening. Walter sat on his porch watching sunset when he noticed something attached to the mailbox. A folded piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The message contained only a few sentences. "Walter, I never forgot my promise. The fence needed fixing. There's more you need to know. Meet me at the old church on Hollow Creek tomorrow at sunrise. Bring no one. Thomas." Walter read the note 3 times. The old church. He knew the location immediately. Abandoned for decades and hidden deep within the mountains. A place few people visited anymore. He looked toward the darkening ridges beyond his ranch. After 46 years, the friend he believed dead was waiting there. And judging by the note, the mystery surrounding the Border Collie, the fence repairs, and Thomas's disappearance was only beginning to reveal itself. Walter Hayes left the ranch long before sunrise the next morning. A thick layer of fog covered the valleys of eastern Tennessee, while pale moonlight illuminated the winding mountain roads leading toward Hollow Creek. The folded note from Thomas Walker rested safely inside his jacket pocket. Several times during the drive, Walter found himself wondering whether any of this was real. 46 years earlier, he stood beside a military chaplain while listening to the official report that declared Thomas missing and presumed dead. For decades, he carried the guilt of surviving when his friend had not. He attended memorial services. He spoke Thomas's name on Memorial Day. He mourned him as only a soldier can mourn another soldier. Yet now, somehow, Thomas was alive. By the time Walter reached the abandoned church, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear beyond the mountains. The small wooden building stood exactly as he remembered from childhood. Weathered, leaning slightly to one side, forgotten by almost everyone. Almost. A familiar black and white Border Collie sat quietly beside the front steps. The dog rose when Walter approached. Up close, the animal appeared even older than before. Gray fur covered much of its face. Several scars marked its legs, yet its eyes remained sharp and intelligent. The dog wagged its tail once before walking toward the church entrance. "I guess you're my escort," Walter muttered. The Border Collie disappeared inside. Walter followed. Thomas Walker sat alone on the front pew. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Both simply stared. Time had changed them. Wrinkles marked their faces. Age had bent their backs. Yet beneath the years, they remained the young soldiers who once crossed jungles together half a world away. Finally, Thomas smiled. "Took you long enough." Walter laughed, despite the tears filling his eyes. 46 years is a long drive. The joke shattered the tension immediately. Within moments, the two old friends embraced. Neither cared about appearances. Neither cared about dignity. They simply held on. When they finally sat down, silence lingered between them. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind shared by men who understand each other without needing words. Eventually, Walter looked directly at him. "How?" Thomas sighed. He had clearly anticipated the question. Slowly, the story emerged. During the operation that supposedly killed him, Thomas had been severely injured after an ambush near the Cambodian border. Separated from his unit and unconscious for days, he was eventually found by local villagers living far from military activity. By the time he recovered enough to travel, the war was ending, and chaos consumed the region. Communication became impossible. Records disappeared. Entire units vanished from official reports. For years, Thomas tried returning home. Each attempt failed. Then life simply continued moving forward. He married, worked, raised a family. But not in America. In a remote region of Southeast Asia, where circumstances kept him far from everything he once knew, Walter listened in stunned silence. "Why didn't you come back later?" Thomas lowered his eyes. "I tried." The answer carried obvious pain. Years after the war, Thomas finally managed to contact American authorities. By then, his records had been closed. His legal identity was tangled in bureaucracy. Worse still, he learned that both of his parents had passed away. Most people from his former life believed he was dead. The longer he stayed away, the harder returning became. Then my wife got sick, Thomas said quietly. After that, my son needed me. Then my grandchildren. Walter understood immediately. Life had happened. Decades disappeared, one responsibility at a time. So why now? Thomas smiled faintly. His gaze shifted toward the Border Collie lying nearby. Because of Scout. Walter looked at the dog. Scout? Best dog I ever had. Thomas scratched behind the collie's ears. Belonged to my grandson originally. Several years earlier, after Thomas's wife died, he finally returned to Tennessee. Not to reclaim his old life, simply to spend his remaining years quietly in the mountains. He purchased a small cabin hidden several ridges away from Walter's ranch. There he lived alone with Scout. You were right there? Walter asked in disbelief. Thomas nodded. 7 miles. Walter shook his head. 7 miles. For years they had lived practically side by side without knowing it. Then Thomas revealed the reason behind the fence repairs. Several months earlier, Scout began wandering farther from the cabin. The old dog frequently visited Walter's ranch. Thomas followed him one evening and discovered whose property it was. I couldn't believe it, he admitted. After all those years. Yet instead of introducing himself immediately, Thomas hesitated. Fear played a role. So did uncertainty. How do you explain 46 years of absence? How do you walk into someone's life after they spent decades believing you were dead? So Thomas watched from a distance. Then a storm damaged Walter's fences. One night, Scout disappeared toward the ranch. Thomas followed and noticed Walter struggling with repairs. The next night we fixed one section, Thomas said. Walter laughed. One section? Thomas smiled. Then Scout wouldn't stop going back. The Border Collie thumped its tail against the floor. Apparently, the dog had made the decision long before either man did. Night after night, Scout led Thomas to the ranch, fence by fence, post by post, slowly rebuilding what the storm had damaged. Yet Walter sensed there was more. Why leave the dog tag? Thomas looked down at his hands. The answer came quietly. Because Scout's dying. Silence filled the church. Walter looked toward the old Border Collie. Suddenly, the gray muzzle and slow movements made painful sense. The vet gave him a few weeks, Thomas continued. Maybe less. The dog rested peacefully beside the pew, unaware of the conversation, unaware of the role he had played. I kept waiting for the perfect time to find you, Thomas said. Scout decided we didn't have time anymore. Walter felt tears forming again. All this, the repaired fences, the mysterious tracks, the dog tag, the reunion. It happened because an old Border Collie refused to let two friends remain separated. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Walter reached down and scratched Scout behind the ears. Good dog, he whispered. The Border Collie looked up at him and wagged his tail. Outside, sunlight continued spreading across the mountains. Yet neither Walter nor Thomas knew that Scout's final gift was still unfolding. Because hidden within Thomas's story was another secret, one connected to a promise made during the war. A promise that neither man had managed to keep. And before Scout's time ran out, he seemed determined to make sure they fulfilled it together. After leaving the old church, Walter Hayes felt as though he had stepped into another lifetime. For nearly half a century, he believed Thomas Walker was dead. Now, suddenly, his oldest friend was sitting 7 miles away in a cabin hidden among the Tennessee mountains. During the following weeks, the two men spent nearly every day together. They drank coffee on Walter's porch, shared stories neither had told anyone else, and slowly filled the enormous gap left by 46 years of separation. Yet despite the joy of their reunion, something continued bothering Walter. Every time conversations drifted toward Vietnam, Thomas became quiet, not evasive, not dishonest, simply distant. The same thing happened whenever Walter mentioned a particular name, Michael Dawson, the third member of their small unit. The young soldier who had disappeared during the same operation that separated Thomas from the rest of the platoon. One afternoon, while Scout slept beneath a maple tree outside Walter's barn, Walter finally decided to ask, "What really happened that day?" Thomas stared across the pasture for a long moment before answering. "I knew eventually you'd ask." Walter remained silent. Thomas took a deep breath. Michael survived the ambush. Walter's head snapped toward him. What? Thomas nodded slowly. At least for a while. The answer struck Walter like a physical blow. For decades, military records listed Michael Dawson as killed in action. No one ever recovered his remains. No one ever knew exactly what happened. Thomas lowered his eyes. After the attack, the three of us were separated. His voice grew quieter. I found Michael later. Walter felt his heart pounding. Was he alive? Barely. The old soldier stared toward the mountains. He was hurt bad. Thomas explained that he and Michael managed to reach an abandoned village several miles from the battlefield. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were non-existent. Both men understood their chances were poor. Yet Michael remained focused on one thing: his family. Before losing consciousness, he gave Thomas a small metal box and made a request. A promise. If either of them survived, the box had to be delivered to Michael's younger sister back in Tennessee. Thomas swallowed hard before continuing. I promised him. Walter already knew what came next. And then? Thomas looked away. Then I lost it. Silence settled between them. For nearly 50 years, Thomas carried that failure. During the chaos following the war, while moving between villages and refugee camps, the metal box disappeared. Stolen. Lost. He never knew which. All he knew was that he broke the last promise Michael Dawson ever asked him to keep. That's why I never came looking for you, Thomas admitted. Every year that passed made it worse. Walter stared at his friend. The weight Thomas carried suddenly made sense. It was never fear that kept him hidden. It was guilt. Scout slowly lifted his head from the grass and wandered toward them. The Border Collie gently rested his muzzle against Thomas's knee. The old soldier smiled sadly and scratched behind the dog's ears. He always knows when I'm thinking about it. Walter looked down at Scout. Then a memory surfaced. Wait. Thomas frowned. What? Walter stood up abruptly. The fence. What about it? The first section Scout fixed. Thomas looked confused. What does that have to do with anything? Walter didn't answer. Instead, he hurried toward the barn. Several minutes later, he emerged carrying a rusted metal container. Thomas immediately froze. Where did you get that? Walter placed it carefully on the table. Found it 20 years ago. The old farmer explained that while replacing a fence line near the northern pasture, he discovered the box buried beneath a tree root. At the time, he assumed it was simply forgotten junk. He never managed to open it. The lock was badly corroded. Thomas stared at the container as though seeing a ghost. His hands trembled. That's it. Walter's eyes widened. You're sure? Thomas nodded. I'd recognize it anywhere. Neither man spoke for several moments. After all these years, the missing box had been sitting inside Walter's barn, less than a mile from where Scout eventually began repairing fences. The coincidence felt impossible, yet there it was. Together they carefully forced the rusted lid open. Inside rested several items protected by layers of oilcloth. A stack of letters, a faded photograph, military insignia, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in faded ink, were 4 words. For my sister, Sarah. Thomas closed his eyes. For nearly 50 years, he believed he had failed. Yet somehow the promise survived. Walter immediately contacted local records offices. The search took several days, but eventually they located Sarah Dawson. Now 74 years old, she lived in Knoxville with her daughter and grandchildren. When Walter explained the situation, she initially thought it was a prank. Then Thomas spoke. The moment she heard details only Michael's closest friends could know, she began crying. A meeting was arranged the following weekend. During the days leading up to it, Scout's condition worsened. The old Border Collie moved slower, ate less, slept more. Yet every morning he still wandered outside to inspect the fences, as though making sure everything remained in order. On the morning of the reunion, Scout insisted on joining them. Thomas helped him into the truck, and the group drove toward Knoxville. Sarah Dawson greeted them at the door. The moment she saw the sealed envelope, tears filled her eyes. For nearly 50 years, she had never known what happened to her brother's final possessions. Now they sat in front of her. The letter contained a simple message. Michael told her he loved her. He apologized for missing future birthdays. He asked her to live a full life. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just the words of a brother trying to comfort his family. By the time she finished reading, Everyone in the room was crying, including Thomas, especially Thomas. The promise had finally been kept. Yet as the sun began setting beyond the Knoxville skyline, Scout quietly rested his head on Thomas's lap and closed his eyes. For the first time all day, he looked completely at peace. And deep down, Walter suspected the old dog knew his final mission was almost complete. The drive back from Knoxville felt different from every journey Walter Hayes and Thomas Walker had taken together before. For the first time in nearly 50 years, neither man carried the weight of an unfinished promise. Sarah Dawson had received her brother's final letter. Michael Dawson's last words had finally reached the family he loved. The burden Thomas carried since Vietnam was gone. Yet as the truck climbed the winding roads back toward the Tennessee mountains, both men remained unusually quiet. Scout slept across the back seat for most of the trip. The old Border Collie barely lifted his head. His breathing was slower now, weaker. Even so, whenever the truck stopped, his eyes immediately searched for Thomas. The bond between them remained as strong as ever. Over the following week, Scout's condition continued declining. The veterinarian confirmed what both men already knew. The old dog was reaching the end of a very long life. Walter noticed that Thomas spent almost every waking hour beside him. Sometimes they sat together on the porch overlooking the pasture. Sometimes they walked slowly along the fence lines they had repaired throughout the winter. Other times they simply rested beneath the large oak tree near Walter's barn. Neither man tried to ignore reality. Scout was dying. But there was something strangely peaceful about the situation. The old Border Collie seemed completely content, almost as though he had been waiting for something. One evening, while the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Walter finally spoke the thought that had been growing in his mind for days. "You know," he said quietly, "none of this would have happened without him." Thomas looked down at Scout lying beside his chair. "I know." Walter shook his head. "Think about it." The old farmer gestured toward the pasture. "He found my ranch. He started leading you here. He kept dragging you back night after night. He made sure I found your dog tag. Then somehow he led us to Michael's box." Thomas smiled faintly. "Sounds impossible when you say it out loud." "Because it is impossible." Neither man could explain it. The logical explanation was a series of coincidences. Yet the more Walter considered everything that happened, the harder coincidence became to believe. Scout had entered their lives at exactly the right moment. Not years earlier. Not years later. Exactly when there was still enough time. 2 mornings later, Walter awoke before sunrise and immediately sensed something was different. The ranch felt unusually quiet. No barking, no movement outside, no familiar scratching at the front door. A strange feeling settled over him. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. Frost covered the fields. The mountains stood silent beneath pale morning light. Walter walked toward the oak tree near the barn. Thomas was already there, sitting on the ground. Scout rested beside him. The old Border Collie looked peaceful. One paw stretched forward, his eyes closed, his breathing gone. Thomas gently stroked the dog's fur. Tears ran silently down his face. Walter sat beside his friend without saying a word. None were necessary. For a long time, the 2 old soldiers simply remained there beneath the tree, while morning sunlight slowly spread across the ranch. Eventually, Thomas smiled through the tears. He waited. Walter nodded. He understood. Scout waited until the promise was fulfilled. Until Michael's letter reached Sarah. Until Thomas found Walter again. Until everything broken had been repaired. Just like the fences, they buried Scout that afternoon on a small hill overlooking the pasture. The same pasture where the mysterious repairs first appeared. Neighbors from across the valley attended. So did Sarah Dawson and her family. Everyone had heard the story by then. The old dog who brought 2 friends back together. The dog who helped keep a promise alive for nearly half a century. After the service ended and everyone left, Walter and Thomas remained beside the grave. A simple wooden marker stood beneath a young maple tree. Carved into the wood were only a few words. Scout, a good dog, a faithful friend. Thomas stared at the marker for several moments. Then he laughed softly. He'd probably hate all this attention. Walter smiled. Probably. Spring arrived several weeks later. Wildflowers appeared across the hillsides. New grass covered the pastures. The repaired fences stood strong beneath clear blue skies. One afternoon, Walter and Thomas walked along the northern property line where everything had begun. Halfway through the pasture, Walter stopped and looked toward the mountains. "You staying?" Thomas followed his gaze. In Tennessee? Walter nodded. Thomas smiled. Yeah. The answer felt right. After spending most of his life searching for where he belonged, Thomas had finally found it. Not in a distant country, not in memories of the past. Right here, beside the friend who never forgot him. Together they continued walking until they reached the first section of fence Scout had repaired. The boards remained sturdy, the nails held firm. Walter rested one hand against the wood and smiled. Funny, he thought. The entire mystery started because an old dog refused to ignore a broken fence. But in the end, the fence was never what needed fixing. It was two lives, a broken friendship separated by war, a forgotten promise buried by time, a family waiting decades for answers. Scout fixed all of it. As the afternoon sun settled across the Tennessee mountains, Walter and Thomas turned toward home. Behind them stood the fences. Ahead of them waited whatever years remained. And somewhere beyond human understanding, perhaps an old Border Collie was still watching over the people he loved, satisfied that his final mission was complete and every promise had finally been kept. Sometimes the people who change our lives never speak a single word. They do not stand in front of crowds. They do not ask for recognition. They simply appear when they are needed most and quietly leave the world a little better than they found it. Scout was one of those souls. To most people, he was just an old Border Collie wandering through the Tennessee mountains. But to Walter Hayes and Thomas Walker, he became something much more. He became the bridge between a broken past and a healed future. For nearly half a century, two friends carried wounds that time never truly healed. Walter mourned a brother he believed was dead. Thomas lived beneath the crushing weight of a promise he thought he had failed to keep. Year after year, both men continued forward while carrying burdens neither deserved to carry alone. Then an old dog decided it was time for that story to end. Night after night, Scout quietly repaired fences. Not because the wood mattered, not because the nails mattered, but because something far more important needed repairing. A friendship, a promise, a family waiting for answers. Sometimes God's miracles arrive in dramatic ways. Other times they arrive with muddy paws, gray fur, and a heart that refuses to give up on the people it loves. Scout never understood military records. He never understood the history of Vietnam. He never understood the decades of grief that followed. Yet somehow he understood exactly where he was needed. Through his loyalty and persistence, a promise survived 46 years. A sister finally received her brother's last words. Two old soldiers found each other again, and a lonely ranch became a home filled with friendship once more. Perhaps that is why stories like this stay with us. Because they remind us that faithfulness matters, promises matter, relationships matter. In a world that often moves too fast, Scout teaches us the value of staying loyal to what is important. He reminds us that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth finding again, no matter how much time has passed. Walter once believed the broken fence was the problem. In reality, it was only the beginning of a much larger repair. God was healing hearts long before anyone realized it. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever had a dog whose loyalty changed your life? Have you ever reconnected with someone you thought was gone forever? We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, faithful dogs, second chances, family, friendship, and the extraordinary ways God works through ordinary lives. May God bless you and your loved ones, heal old wounds, restore broken relationships, and remind you that it is never too late for a promise to be fulfilled. And may you always remember that sometimes the greatest heroes are not the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes they walk on four legs, ask for nothing in return, and spend their lives quietly, helping others find their way home.